Well, hello and welcome to Working Rangelands Wednesdays, where we explore topics around rangeland agriculture in California and throughout the West. My name is Dan Macon. I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension, covering Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties.
Hi, I'm Leslie Roach, a Cooperative Extension Specialist in Rangeland Science and Management with the University of California, Davis.
And I'm Grace Wood-Nancy. I'm currently a grad student at UC Davis, and Dan and Leslie are my advisors.
Well, welcome to everybody that joined us today. A few things before we get started. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted later this week on our UC Rangelands YouTube channel, along with all of the previous webinars. We have again submitted this webinar to the Society for Range Management for continuing education units and expect that we will have that approval within the next couple of days. For our live webinar participants, we ask that you use the chat or Q&A pods for your questions. We'll keep an eye on the questions and we'll have time at the end of the hour for follow-up and for asking these questions. So today, we're going to do the third of a series of producer panels on drought impacts. We looked previously at how drought impacts private land ranching operations and public land ranching operations. And today we've got three producers who are all in the targeted grazing business. And we wanted to find out how drought impacted their operations and how they prepare for those types of things. So our panelists today include Andrée Soares, who is the president of Star Creek Land Stewards in Los Banos and a member of the Range Management Advisory Committee to the Board of Forestry here in California. Brad Fowler, who is the owner of the Goat Works in Grass Valley, California, uses goats and sheep primarily in his operation. And then Nathan Medlar, who's the owner of NM Ranch Services in Auburn, California, also goat and sheep grazers. So welcome to our panelists and thank you for joining us today. So the first question for all three of you is really, how did you get started in targeted grazing? What brought you to this business and how long have you been doing it? Andrée, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay. I've been in business just since 2014. Was raised in a commercial sheep ranching family. My parents and their parents before them did commercial sheep ranching. I, however, went away to college, became a registered nurse and did that for 29 years. And then an opportunity was brought to me by actually a gentleman who was working for my father as his foreman at the time about this targeted grazing business separate from my father's commercial business. And I really had never crossed my mind, never thought about it, didn't even know what targeted grazing was, never dreamt I would even be a part of my father's business. But everything was it was the right time for everything. And I did a little bit of research and decided to buy a company that was currently in business, and the gentleman was no longer interested in carrying it on. And that's how it started. And I've been in it ever since 2014 and resigned from nursing around 2016, I think, and been doing it this full time since that time.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Brad, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your business. How did you get started?
We bought a fledgling goat enterprise in 2006 or 7, and it was a starting out targeted grazing business, and we stumbled along with it for 5 or 6 years, and finally got our heads around it, and it's been a decent little enterprise for us ever since. We mostly target Nevada, Yuba, and Placer counties, so we're fairly we like to stay pretty close to home.
Great. And Nathan, how about you? How did you get started?
Well, I have a record probably back to 2011. Prior to that, I just bought net and tried to get free feed for the animals we had. But I probably started really charging around 2011, and I was still working dirt work, construction. And so I fluctuated in numbers up and down, trying to get started. and they started sending me out of town a lot. So I spent 2 or 3 years out of town, and that really hurt our start. And then I quit my job in 2014 and really started doing this grazing. So.
And Nathan, what kinds of projects do you typically do?
Fire prevention is our number one. We will do some targeted grazing of yellow star thistle mainly, and blackberry removal, some brush removal, but and then we just started working with some people for restoration projects on wetlands and stuff like that. That is privately owned, and that has been a different experience than the fire prevention or even the targeted grazing for removal of yellow star.
Brad, how about you? What kinds of projects do you typically do?
When we first got into business, we thought the demand was in the targeted grazing, just specific weeds, and it turns out that fire prevention is probably 90% of our work. It's on occasion we will get calls to do specific weeds or berries or something like that, but really in California, fire drives everything. And that's kind of, and it hasn't been a shift on our end. It's just been a shift, and that's what the business wants. That's what people want. Everybody's afraid of fire, so it works out pretty fire.
And is your clientele typically agencies or private businesses, or kind of all of the above?
Utility and municipality mostly, and then some HOAs.
Okay.
That just maintain some open space, but it seems like mostly municipal or utility work.
And Andrée, you were telling us before we got started where all you have animals right now, but what kinds of projects do you typically do, and how spread out are you at the moment?
Right now we have herds in Half Moon Bay, 2 herds in Half Moon Bay, 3 herds in Marin County, and 2 herds in Berkeley and a herd in Carquinez. Wow. I think that's all of them. And most of the work that we do is, I would say we're probably about 80-20, 80 public agency and 20 private. The main focus of all those is fire prevention, but there is some more stewardship type restoration projects that we do, and those are quite different. I agree with Nathan; those are quite different to do, but they're kind of fun to do, because you actually, if you go back year after year, well, it's the case in all of them actually. You go back year after year, that what the impact of the livestock on the land is amazing. So it's just kind of fun to see what you can do besides taking the grassland down. But when the landscape starts changing, that's really fun.
Yeah, I'll bet. Brad, maybe start this next question with you. Do you have animals on projects year round, or do you have a home base that you go to?
So we used to have animals on projects year round, and for us, it was better for the animals if we could give them a break. So my goal is always to, my goal has been to keep the animals busy 8 or 9 months out of the year, and then bring them home to kid and lamb out. In my perfect world, I'd have them home for about 6 months out of the year. I think I'd work from April to October and then take the rest of the year off. So we have a little bit of ground that we lease up in Grass Valley that we can park them on. And it's pretty good to keep them on the ranch and do some work at home, because we have some actual targeted grazing that we need to do here that we can't do during the season. So, and then we just have to balance out with some cows that we keep around.
Nathan, what about you? Do you have a home base, or are you trying to keep animals out on projects all year round?
So we only actually own 1 acre to our name, and then we have agreements to run on larger pieces of property that are closer to our home. So the goal right now is we run about 6 months on projects. So we run when the irrigation is running, let's say we're on projects. And then 2 months after that, we can run on our home-based projects. We'll pick up some extra work that is falling behind with animals that are not bred or are too young to be bred. We'll still work them in the fall. We breed off season, so we want to give our animals about a month break before they start kidding and lambing. And then we run about 4 months on farm ground, and then we will return home to our home bases. About 200 acres we have that we use for our home base. 2 months prior to grazing, we will be back there prepping to get ready to go to work. But it really all depends on the weather.
Yeah, okay. Andrée, how about you? Do you try to have animals out all the time, or do you have a home base that you go back to?
We have a home base we go back to. Generally speaking, we're grazing, beginning to send animals out middle of February and beginning to get them back home by the middle of September.
Okay.
And so they kind of taper out and then taper back in. And during those non-grazing months, we're doing the same, prepping them with better feed, more attention, less transportation during, a month or so before lambing and kidding, and then we lamb and kid them all out here at home. And we don't do any of that out on our grazing jobs. And then as they're ready to go out, we send them out, and everything starts again. We do send some pairs out grazing to a particular location, and it's because it's a very big space and it's not near a lot of it's not as public as some of the others, because where there's life, there's death, and that always that's a challenge in the public eye. So
Brad and Nathan, how about you guys? Do you ever lamb or kid on a project, and will you take pairs on a project?
So we never want to lamb or kid on projects. We always end up dropping a couple here and there, either late or whatever. Ideally, we would never lamb or kid on projects, and we do take pairs, and we'll sort off kids and lambs in between moves as they get bigger. And I think right now I've still got a bunch of kids and lambs on projects with their mothers, but they start running their moms down pretty hard right now.
Yeah. Nathan, what about you guys?
We will wean in March usually, and the kids that get weaned in March, they will go onto a separate project, grazing project. We have 2 projects that they can learn what to eat, and it's larger projects, so it takes them a little longer. So we're not transporting them a lot, so it's less stress on them. We can keep an eye on them. Caitlin and I can run those projects, and we can keep an eye on the babies, be it lambs or kids. And we will not run pairs on projects. I found it very difficult for working dogs to gather. Walking them anywhere is difficult. If you have health issues, you're dealing with the public and or the landowner. And it just becomes more of a hassle for me. So we like to keep them separated when we're doing grazing projects.
So turning now to kind of the drought question, if you guys think back to the 2011 to 2015 or 2016 drought, what kinds of impacts did you experience, either positive or negative? And were the impacts different on your home base than they were on your projects? Andrée, maybe we'll start with you this time. What kinds of things did you know that was somewhat prior to your involvement to a certain
Well,
extent.
What it did from my perspective, yeah, I did start. My first full grazing year I began in January of 2014. But what it did for me was, especially in 15 and 16, was I had a certain baseline for at which pace I could move through projects. And as I'm trying to build out my calendar through September, I had my 2014 year to go on. And so things changed a lot. 2015, 2016, we moved much quicker through those same projects. And so some ways it was good. Actually, it wasn't bad. It didn't work against me. It actually, what it caused me to do was hustle more work, which wasn't a bad thing. I created more relationships and it worked. But it was something I wasn't prepared to. I didn't see that coming. I didn't anticipate that. Worked out well for the animals. Actually, some of those drought years, the feed was not bad in those places. There wasn't a lot of it, but it was actually not bad where it was. And so the animals did just fine. We did have to do a little bit of supplementing where we had not the year before and where we haven't since, those years, but
Yeah.
It really wasn't bad. It was really the biggest challenge was the pacing and my ability to anticipate that with regard to my scheduling.
Yeah. I should have asked all of you guys this first. How do you get paid for this work? Is it per acre or per head per day or?
Well, that's another thing that impacted me with regard to that is I until 2 years ago, I had done it all by a per acre rate. 2 years ago, I started doing some projects by the day. And it was because many people had gotten together and it was easier for them. It was easier for me. And it was a rate that everybody could live with. And so that I was able to do a rate per day, which again, in a drought year or in a year where you're making because we're like we mentioned, we're changing the landscape. So we're moving quicker on year 3 than we did on the same land in year 1. So I have to be thoughtful of that. I'm spending less time on those projects that I'm getting paid by the day for. So.
Yeah. Brad, what about you? What kinds of impacts did you see from the drought in your business?
So similar to what Andrée said, I had a different baseline. So I knew that historically projects would take X amount of days. And so during the drought, and we do charge by the acre, during the drought, we covered more ground faster. And it was probably our most profitable years because we charged what we had charged. We were still doing the same work, but when there's less forage on the ground and we just need to get the forage to whatever the standard was, we were able to accomplish that a lot faster than we had in the past. So we moved through a lot of ground and it's exactly what Andrée said. We were able to do more work. It seems like there's always more demand than there is grazing livestock to fulfill the fire hat. So it's never been a challenge to find places to go. It's just you get to pick which ones are the headaches and which ones are worth doing.
Define a headache. What gives you what causes a headache for you, Brad?
The more people I have to talk to is and I enjoy talking with people, but it takes time out of my day and it takes time out of their day. So I don't like doing anything less than 5 acres, and I don't like doing residential. The least amount of residential work I can do is best. Even on some of our utility contracts, we still have to interact with people. The most fun we've had is forestry projects where there's no people. Because we just get to deal with the animals, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But the more acres I can cover with one point of contact is the easiest for me to deal with.
Yeah. Nathan, how about you?
Well, so on the drought side of things, from 2011 and up, we were able to grow our business every year. And it was mainly due to people being afraid of fires and wanting fire prevention. So the need was there and we were trying to fulfill it. We were not growing fast enough at that point. And we charge off of an acre, but how I come up with that acre price is due to how difficult the project's going to be to fence, water source, and how many animals am I going to have available, because I want to know how many days that's going to take, and I want to be able to make X amount every day, really, because we're bringing money in only 6 months out of the year, or 6 or 8 months out of the year. So that gets adjusted per job. I just don't have a flat rate per acre. Mm-hmm. So that's how we go about it. With the dry fuel, I agree with Brad and Andrée on this, is you're moving through projects twice as fast. Well, maybe not twice as fast, but much faster for several reasons. You're changing the feed and there's less of it in a drought year. Now, we've had years where we get early rains and then no rain and then some rain in the end, which may cause a boost in feed, but the feed is rank by the time you get to it. So the sheep aren't going through it, or the goats aren't going through it as fast. So I think all of us have to adjust on the fly. Every year is different, and the weather is one of the large portions of that pushes us one way or another.
Do you guys think that you have more flexibility when it comes to drought than kind of a traditional rancher who may be based in a particular place? And how does that play out in your decision making? Do you think you're more flexible or adaptable?
I would say, I've seen both type of operations running parallel tracks, and I would say yes to that, because we're scheduling, right? We're scheduling in advance. I try to schedule as far out in advance as I can, and we're scheduling because the client has feed for us to eat, right? So I know I'll have a place to go if I've done my job, and getting the herd scheduled. And there's less, I think, in the commercial side, I would say there's less, you always have a backup plan, but may not have a plan C or D. And I feel like in my business with the targeted grazing, I often have plan C or D ahead of me.
That's a good point. Nathan, what about you? How do you view flexibility in that regard?
I think flexibility is on our side. When we got started, it was one reason we got started is competing with cattle. Everybody's competing for cattle ground, and the electric fence changed that business for us with moving our animals. We don't have to have a home base where we're trying to put weight on lambs. And I think the other flexibility on that is I'm not trying to put weight on animals. I definitely want to keep our animals in great shape and healthy. That's our number one priority. But we're doing a different job, so we can supplement a little bit if we need to, and pass that on to the customer if we need to do the same job, or we take it in the shorts on that one, depending on the year. I think that we are much more flexible than any other industry of raising lamb or calves or something like that.
And that is a technical ranch term, take it in the shorts, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Brad, how about you? You've kind of got both worlds in your operation too. Do you have more or less flexibility with your targeted grazing operation?
So I think we're infinitely flexible in our targeted grazing. I think in the drought years we're a little bit in the cow business too, just enough to be bigger than a hobby and not like a full-scale business. So during the drought years, we were scrambling for feed for cows, and everybody everybody in 3 or 5 counties was scrambling for the same blades of grass, and they weren't there. And so that was really tough on the cow side of it. But with the sheep and goats, there was always places to go. And so, and because of targeted grazing, we don't need a land base. Between my place and yours, Dan's, I could knock on 50 doors and 50 people would say, bring your sheep and goats. And in the cow business, you can't do that. All that ground is tied up for cows. But in the foothills, there's a ton of places that we can stick the animals. So our flexibility that's built into our business, we are a mobile ranch, right? When we bring corrals and water and all of our equipment, we're bringing our ranch infrastructure everywhere we go, and we can set it up. I could pack up tomorrow and move to Wyoming and start grazing. And we can't do that with any other livestock. The small ruminants are just incredibly portable, and all the infrastructure is pretty portable. So it's a built-in flexibility. And I guess that depends on your scale too. We're less than 1,000 animals, so we're a small scale deal. But there's a lot of flexibility in that business model.
I want to come back to something that Nathan alluded to, because it gets to this flexibility question, I think, a little bit. You talk about in your business, you're getting paid to graze, but not necessarily to put weight on animals or to get a high rate of reproduction. So how does that basic difference in how you get paid versus how a conventional operation gets paid influence the drought strategies that you use? Does that make sense? Let's start with Nathan.
So in the past, drought hasn't had it has its negative effects, but on my decision making on let's say getting rid of animals so that we have more feed, we don't necessarily do that. I'm going to cull animals that are not productive in our system or have not worked out. And we have a different market for our weather goats or our weather lambs. And so we're not looking for traditional ways of being short on feed. So I don't base the drought or my numbers or my culling decisions or make a drought plan necessarily. I need to keep as many numbers on the ground that are healthy and running. Because we run on farm ground in the winter, there is feed to go to in the winter, and it's being irrigated all summer. So I don't have to necessarily worry about the feed so much. One thing that we have done is if we're going to buy supplemental feed, we buy it in bulk. So we'll buy a semi-load of hay instead of buying hay at the feed store. So those are things that we've changed.
Andrée, how about you? You think there's some inherent differences because of how you get paid and in the types of decisions you make?
I think so, for sure. The main source of income is definitely from the grazing. Mm-hmm. Now, that being said, the health of the animals is our number one priority, because they're making money for us every day. So we want them to be healthy. We want them to be productive. We want to be able to grow our own herds. And so the animal husbandry side is very, very important. But we're not really looking at putting on a lot of weight on our animals to this point. I will say that we might be at a point where that's starting to shift and might be looking at a different outlet for different goals for particularly the goat production. Mm-hmm. Now that we've gotten our herd size up to something we think we're happy with. I've been saying that for 4 years, by the way, but I think we're happy with this herd size. Now it's time to start looking for some avenues to enter the goat meat production side. And so that could, if you ask me the same question a year from now, I could have a different answer.
That's a good point. Brad, you've kind of got both a traditional enterprise with your cows and then a targeted enterprise with the small ruminants. How are your priority? You talked a little bit about this, but what's your priority for the cows in terms of making money from them?
So the cows is more of a conventional type operation where we sell calves, and so they have to be on good feed. We wean and sell calves, and it's still a fairly informal program. I described it as a small scale business, but it's still a borderline hobbyish enterprise.
It's so you can wear a cowboy hat. We do sell
calves. Right? That's exactly the reason. It's better than the goat boy hat. I think that's what I'm wearing now. But the targeted grazing with the sheep and goats, most of our revenue, probably 3/4 of our revenue, is from grazing So the kid and lamb crop has always just been a byproduct for us. And really, I think we could do a pretty decent job if we never had breeding animals in that enterprise. It's nice to get a couple extra checks during the course of the year, but most of the money we make in the 6 months, and so we can sock it away and use it in the wintertime. And we will barn up some hay and hold some ground back, but it's the grazing really drives. We are not in. I would not describe myself as being in the lamb or goat business. We are really in the grazing business, and the lambs and the kids are just a byproduct, and it's just a marginally profitable byproduct for us.
Okay.
I'd like to clarify something because I would be remiss if I didn't. The sheep side of our operation is the sheep production that we produce. We run Dorpers in our grazing operation. The Dorpers that we raise every year, those do have a pretty strong market. I mean, we're very focused with our offspring every year from our lambs. We've not been so much. We've been trying to grow the sheep side of our grazing operation at a slower rate than we have our goat side. But the sheep side, we have had a very focused production program with them. We like to get them up to only about 80 pounds and sell what we keep our replacements and sell the rest. And that's kind of been, that's actually been fun to do.
You know, that brings up another question too. Can you just go out and buy sheep or goats that'll work in your business, or do you have to raise them yourself to be successful? How does that work? Brad, I know you've talked about that in the past.
So we've bought goats in the past, and if you buy them from another producer, sometimes you can do okay on that if they're in a similar program. I don't think you can ever buy an animal that's as good as the one you can make. Our sheep and our goats are all pretty dang hardy. They're generations into this. They know the netting. They're born in the netting. They know the trailer. And if I went to the sale barn and bought, or wherever, and bought loads of goats, it would be a disaster for 3 years until they figured out what was going on. So I don't think you can ever, even just for the minor differences between mine and Nathan's program, and we're both in similar country, it's entirely possible that my animals wouldn't hold up in his deal, or his animals wouldn't hold up in my deal, even though they're probably exposed to the same forage. We just do things differently. So yeah, I absolutely, you can't buy them half as good as you can make them.
And Andrée, does that suggest that it takes longer to grow this business than just going out and buying a band of sheep?
Depends on how quickly you want to grow, but yeah, I think I agree 100% with what Brad said. Since I've been in business, I did buy one load of goats from another producer, and I wouldn't say it didn't work out, but we learned that we didn't really want to go that route. That's when we learned we really want to just stay homegrown as much as possible.
Yeah.
For all the reasons Brad mentioned.
Nathan, any different take on that, or has that been your experience as well?
Not a whole lot of different takes. One of our priorities in our company is making replacements and holding back what's going to work for us, and then selling the stuff that's not going to work for us. We tend to sell our wether lambs while they're lambs. We try to sell them when they're up to weight and before we start grazing, where I will hold on to the weathered goats for much longer. And we have discovered a market that works for our timing of raising them. So I like to put less stress on them, on the kids and the lambs, because we'll run our ewe lambs with our goats, put them on, like I said, two large projects. They have less stress. They still learn all the ropes to learn when they're very little, what a trailer is, what a border collie is, what a guard dog is. And I definitely think the best animals for anybody in the business, whatever you're raising is probably the best that you can have for what your operation is. I don't think that it's a bad idea to buy from another producer, but there's still going to be a period of time where the animals are learning your system.
Yeah. So one last question for all three of you. If you look back at the drought, the big drought, what were the main takeaways? What would you do different if we had another 5-year drought today? Anything?
I would say the last 5-year drought, I was a little bit ignorant because of my recent entry into the business. And it worked out fine for me because I have a lot of really smart people around me. But it just reinforced the need to really look ahead down the road. I had to do better planning, make sure my planning is as sound as possible, all of that kind of things, that kind of stuff.
Nathan, how about you? Anything you'd do different or big takeaways?
I think planning is a huge part of that. With drought, on the side of, for us, it would be how big do we want to get? How many animals do we want to run? Because you're going to be running your tail off, moving the animals faster. You can pick up more money by working, but you have to go with them somewhere, and you will start grazing for a lesser price and or for free just to keep your numbers up. So I think coming up with a plan and setting goals would really help that to figure out what you really want to do with your business. I think one thing we found out ahead of time is lining up. If you're going to buy supplemental feed, line it up in bulk ahead of time and not wait till the last minute. Have it stored. We try to put some hay away or grain, depending on what we're doing, what our goals are. We try to buy that ahead of time so that we have it. We're not scrambling at the last minute.
And Brad, how about you? What were your takeaways, or what would you do different?
Just planning, just having like I think Andrée said, have plans B, C, D, and E lined up. If I knew there was another 5-year drought coming up, I would get out of the livestock business. I would sell my animals to Nathan and my contracts. And I'd buy a remote control store or something. I don't know what I'd do. I'd do something else.
Well, I think those are all really good points, and I think we'll bring our other two hosts back on now to start questions. But as they come on, maybe talk a little bit about the difference between sheep and goats. Is there a place for one that doesn't work for another, or are they kind of interchangeable in that regard? What's your experience?
I would say that there's definitely some places that are for one and not the other, but there are some places where they both do really well and where a mixed herd is really, really great. This year, you know, the brushy brush, goats do really well. Mostly grasses, sheep do really well there, but mixed forage, a mixed herd does a really nice job. One of the things we did this year in one of our projects in Marin, it was our 3rd year there. And because the landscape had changed, we're grazing the same area. Because we had altered the landscape, it was really time to start adding sheep to that herd, whereas before they really needed just goats. And adding sheep to it, we feel like we were targeting some of that project was not just fire, but it was also targeting goat grass. And we'll see there were some people looking at studying that a little bit. We'll see how that came out. But I think that there is definitely a prescription that you can kind of hone in on when you're in the areas long enough.
Excellent. Excellent. Anything you guys would add, Nathan or Brad?
I would add that when we got in the business, we just had goats, and there's a perception that people want to hire goats because they eat anything or whatever. And we discovered that a lot of the places that were hiring goats really would have been better served by hiring sheep. Is a lot of just grasslands, just flashy fields, and they just wanted the flashy grasses knocked down, and sheep can do a better job at that. People still have it in their head that they're hiring goats, and maybe it's because we have hair sheep. They don't know that they're not goats. And sometimes we have to throw some goats in with the sheep, but we run a mix of probably 50-50. And there's times when there's projects that are all goat feed, and just exactly what Andrée said, 5 years into it, you find out that it's not goat feed anymore, or there's a little bit, but you're turning it into sheep feed. You're reducing those brushy species. So the mix really serves us well. And there's places that we only take sheep, and there's places that we only take goats. And a lot of the year they run together.
I've always thought that maybe like a 2-page field guide for the public to say, this is a goat, this is the sheep, would be useful to hand out.
Yeah.
So Leslie, I think
it's hard with the hair sheep.
It is. Absolutely. Absolutely. Leslie, I think we've had some questions come in. You want to kind of synthesize and start us off with questions?
Yeah, sure. So one of the first questions we have is, you all kind of talked about grazing mostly on public lands. So there's a question about, is that because these landscapes are typically more extensive or larger than private lands, or is this just where there's more opportunities in terms of public agencies, municipalities, others willing to pay for the services? So I think it's a question about, why is there more opportunities on public versus private land? I think that's what they're getting at.
I would say that, yes, in my experience, and I don't know that this is a fact, but most contiguous pieces of property in California are either publicly owned or owned by, could be a private owner that already has a management plan that includes livestock and may not need goats. But my experience is it's the public, majority of the time is the public lands that have not been managed for vegetation for a lot of years. And for whatever reason, there has been a public push for those agencies to use a more holistic approach to managing that vegetation. So I think the public agencies are the machine, but I think the private people drive that a lot with their input on what happens on public lands. I do have a lot of private clients, but there are, what I've learned is something that a lot of people probably have known for a long time, and that it's the whole phenomenon of private ranches that are converting out of family-owned lifetimes being sold to maybe another private owner who has no livestock background, has no knowledge of why livestock should be on the ground. They just want this beautiful ranch. But then over time, they realize once the livestock are gone, when they left with the previous owner and they haven't re-implemented livestock on their land, they have a major fire risk. And so I've seen a lot of those private people come back into the business, not by owning their own, but by leasing out to cattle and goats, or just bringing on goats seasonally.
In terms of, thinking about with regard to fire control, how do, the typical residual dry matter levels and guidelines that some of these agencies might have, and you talked a little bit about drought already, but how do those impact the sort of your targeted grazing plans and operations? And we kind of a related question of, how intensely do you manage these grasslands in the context of, making them fire resistant, in terms of, what are those residual dry matter levels? Are you able to, work with these agencies in terms of flexibility of what they want to be fire resistant, but for the balance of, leaving vegetation for sort of soil cover and protection, but then also not wanting to leave vegetation because it's just dry fuel?
A lot of the people that we work with are very sensitive to that, and we tell them we won't graze it down to the ground. If that's what you want, I'm not going to do that to my animals, and I won't do it to your land. And once you talk to them a little bit about it, they get it. If you start talking about erosion and soil stabilization, they get it. So some of the projects I'm working with a biologist or someone who's really monitoring the RDM, and some projects we agree on 4 to 6 or less than 6 inch leave behind on the vegetation, and just a lot. The key is a lot of communication with your client on what your goals are.
Brad or Nathan, do you guys usually suggest a grazing level, or is that something that the contract lines out?
Some agencies,
we have. Go ahead.
No, some agencies have it written out for you, and so you can pick and choose if that contract is going to be good for your herd health or your management style. On the some of these contracts that come up, privately owned and stuff, it's an education thing, and just having a conversation with them about erosion and leaving dry matter into the ground and having that animal impact on top of the grazing that can create, you can be constructive or destructive with your grazing. And so it just comes down to management. And yeah, we're getting paid and whoever writes a check, but it really comes down to you can put a lot of hurt on your animals by grazing it too close to the ground too often. And so you want something to come back to and have a good name for the business in general. If we're all eating it to the dirt, eventually that might not be good for our industry.
Brad, what were you going to say there?
I was going to say every landowner has a different goal, but there's no place that we graze that won't burn when we're done. It will all carry a fire, but what we're doing with our grazing animals, we're changing the characteristics of the fire. So whatever the standard of the landowner or the land manager is, we can achieve that standard. I don't remember any place that we've ever had to, I'm sure we have. We've probably taken places to bare mineral soil, and that was probably at the request of the landowner, and we probably have to feed like heck on top of it to get it to that condition. We'd prefer not to. And I explain to people, it's just like Nathan said about educating, that this ground will still carry a fire, but maybe it's just a little fire that it's just going to skunk around in the little bit of residual grass and we can stomp it out. It's not going to be a rip roaring through the understory. We're just changing how a fire will behave on the landscape, and we're not making it fire safe. If somebody asks me if I can make it absolutely fire safe, well, I can't do that. I won't do that. And I don't think any of us, maybe there's a couple grazers out there that are still taking it down pretty hard. But I don't want it to be a desert when I pull out.
In terms of some of those other land manager goals, so for example, targeting specific weeds, other species, Do they also kind of in their plans or communication with you about, specific windows of time of when they need, and how do you work around that? You mentioned earlier that there's never enough animals to make it everywhere, but what happens when they have a specific window of time where they need a specific species targeted?
We just do our best, communicate, let them know in the beginning of the season, because oftentimes I'm entering into contracts with those entities early on, and then it's me and Mother Nature trying to get them there. In that time that I try not to promise any specific date. But for example, this one area, we were grazing within it, and then they wanted us out by do as much as we could up until a certain date in May, because of goat grass. So and then left, and this was our plan that we developed early on, then leave and then come back. So we just, and everybody understands what those requirements are, and costs are to do that up front. But just try to be flexible and communicate early and often about what their needs are, and just see what you can do to adapt.
Mm-hmm. So there's been go ahead.
I was going to say, on that scheduling thing, it seems like the most demand. Everybody wants animals, at least in our neighborhood, everybody wants animals June 1st, because that's when the grass starts to dry out a little bit, and there's a perception that that's the ideal date. So we could run about 400,000 goats in California June 1st, and maybe for the next 2 weeks, and then I don't know what we do with them after that. But people do have desires of when they'd like. Locally, I like to hit star thistle July 1st, but I can't cover that much ground July 1st, and so whoever's first in line, whoever has a signed contract first is where I go, and it just works itself out.
So there's been, I think over the last couple of years, there's been quite a few conversations about a certification process for targeted grazers, not just here in the state, but also I think across the West. So some of those conversations are happening in the Society for Ranger Management. Do you all, would you see this as beneficial to your operations? What are your sort of thoughts on some of these conversations that are happening right now?
I have an opinion on that. We already have a certification process for our business. It's called the free market, and bad grazers go out of business. There are bad characters. There are people that do knucklehead things in this business. They generally don't stick around. I don't think that the bad actors are actually hurting the industry. I still think there's more demand for our services and for people doing contract grazing services than anybody in California can fulfill right now. I just see a certification as an additional hoop or hurdle that I just see it as an impediment to business rather than any kind of a benefit. I think we should just let the market settle itself. I feel strongly about that.
I agree with Brad. And that was exactly my answer when I was asked about this directly a year ago. It was, I just don't know enough about what a certification process would provide that the free market doesn't already provide. And to be 100% honest, I don't have a lot of faith in the certification process being able to be maintained in a way that would make a difference for clients. Someone may be able to maintain a certification and really not perform the way things need to be done without monitoring and evaluations and follow up, and and who's going to do that with the client? I just don't. I see it being something that's could create a lot of work for a lot of people on both sides, those providing the certification and those being certified. And I don't see the benefit of it. I've worked with a lot of agencies over the last 7 years, and never once have I been asked that question. Not one time have I been asked, is there a certification? Is there something that you should have or could have or other people have or should I ask for? Not once. So I'm not sure what problem we're trying to solve. I think we're probably going to be creating a problem.
And actually, I'd like to elaborate just a touch more. California already has the California State Licensing Board that monitors all the contractors. And so to be a contractor in California, there's a long list of hoops and hurdles and tests that you have to do and be certified and bonded. There's still knucklehead contractors that rip people off. So being able to pass the test and fill out the paperwork doesn't certify anybody's character or show that they're doing good work. So we have a model of a very extensive certification process that still people slip through the cracks. So I can't see why it would be any different in a livestock or a grazing for hire enterprise.
I think it's a really good point.
I would add that the California Wool Growers Association, that represents sheep and goat producers across the state, is passed a resolution not in support of the certification process for all the reasons that we've discussed.
Leslie, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, actually, so there's two questions actually, and this is kind of just leaving everybody with your parting thoughts. It's a two-part question. What would be your first piece of advice to someone who wants to start a targeted grazing enterprise? And on the flip side of that, what would be your advice to some of these agencies or municipalities that are just starting to get into and thinking about contracting with, for potential targeted grazing projects? So advice for someone wanting to get into the business, and advice maybe for some agencies that have never really worked with targeted grazing operations, but that potentially have a need.
I'll take this one first. I would say for people that are entering or wanting to enter into business as a targeted grazing or contract grazer, I would find a mentor that's in the business already and learn the hoops, because there is a lot of stuff you can learn the hard way that can hurt you financially, can give you heartache. I think that if you're working with somebody or have a mentor, you can see the day in and day out of things. Now, finding that mentor might be hard. That's something that I wish I would have done, even if it wasn't with the contract grazer. Maybe go find a sheep company and work with them for several years and learn some of the things that the animals need and how they act and what problems you can run into. And the second part with other agencies hiring for the first time, call around to all the other agencies that are already doing it. Find out who's the names to stay away from and the names to call. They know who does a good job. They know who they have to call a lot. They know who they never have to call when we're working.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
My advice
Nathan summed that up 100%. Go ahead.
My advice to someone entering the business is be prepared. It is a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, 365-day commitment. And you have to be ready for that. And secondly, you can't starve a profit out of your animals. If you take care of your animals will take care of you. So you have to be prepared to take care of your animals. So you have to understand what that means. And I think that leads into what Nathan's advice was. You really have to spend some time with a mentor and understand what some of those needs are.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you. Brad, did you have something to add there?
I was just going to say Nathan and Andrée nailed it. One time somebody said to me that the grazing enterprise, that's a really great passive income. And I wanted to punch them in the throat. There is nothing passive about this business. The animals are working and we're working. So, but they covered everything.
I manage my father's commercial operation and run the my targeted grazing operation. Targeted grazing operation is 20 times as intense as a commercial business operation. That's my experience. There's just you guys, there's just you got a lot of things on the burner at the same time.
Yeah, something to add to that is when we started this, or when I started getting into this business, I wanted to own my own business and be my own boss. And what I did was created a full-time job that takes all daylight hours. And it may be like this morning, we started at 4:30. So I get a break today because I'm on this, and we're going to go back out after a little while. So your time is wrapped up differently. You could be sitting down and having dinner and get a phone call and go do it. So if you don't want a full-time job, I wouldn't suggest getting into this business.
I think that's a really good point to end on. Thank you all for spending time and letting us interrupt what otherwise is a really busy time of year for you guys. I know you got plenty going on, so thank you very much. For those of you still on the webinar, our next webinar will be on Wednesday, August 12th, and we're going to dive a little deeper into the topic of grazing and fire. So join us for that, and thank you for joining today. We will send the link out for this post if you want to review it. And please, if you have further questions, or if we didn't get to a question that you asked, get in touch with Leslie or Grace or myself, and we'll make sure we communicate that with our panelists. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.